Don't go to your husband's funeral. Check on your sister. She's not alone. A note changed my life on my darkest day. Hello, thank you for being here with me today. It's taken me a long time to be able to tell this story. Some days, I still wake up and for a split second, I forget it ever happened. Then it all comes rushing back. It all started on what was supposed to be the worst day of my life, the day I was going to bury my husband. That morning, the day of Arthur's funeral, the air in the house was still and heavy, like it was holding its breath. I was already in the black dress I'd bought 3 days ago, a dress I never wanted to own. I'd been numb for weeks, ever since Arthur's sudden illness had taken a turn for the worse. The doctors had talked about heart failure, about stress, about how a man so full of life could just fade. I'd spent countless nights in a stiff hospital chair, watching him sleep, his face pale against the white pillows. Now, all that was left was the hollow echo of his absence and this one final, terrible duty. I was just about to head out the door when I remembered the mail. I walked down the porch steps automatically, my mind a million miles away, and opened the little metal door of the mailbox. Tucked between a circular and a bill was a plain white envelope. No name, no return address. Just my address, printed neatly. Curiosity, a small, faint flicker in the fog of my grief, made me open it. Inside, there was just a single sheet of paper with a few words typed out in stark, block letters. Don't go to your husband's funeral. Check on your sister. She's not alone. I read it once. Then twice. My first reaction wasn't even anger, it was just confusion. It felt like a line from a bad movie. I stood on my own front porch, the world silent except for the chirping of a bird in the old oak tree, and stared at those words. My hands started to shake, a tremor that began in my fingers and worked its way up my arms. It wasn't the cold. It was that feeling you get deep in your gut, a primal alarm bell, when you know your world is about to shatter, but you can't see the hammer yet. This has to be a sick joke. That's what I told myself. Some cruel, disturbed person taking advantage of a grieving widow. I thought of the kids down the street, or maybe a disgruntled former colleague of Arthur's. I crumpled the note in my fist, ready to throw it into the trash can by the steps. I almost did. I was so close. But something held me back. The words were too specific. It wasn't vague. It didn't say, check on your sister, or something's up with Diane. No, the words were precise, she's not alone. It felt less like a prank and more like a warning, a piece of information from someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. Someone who had seen something. I glanced at my watch. 8 a.m. The funeral was at 10 o'clock. The black car from the funeral home was already parked out front, a silent, dark vessel waiting to take me. The driver, a kind man who had offered his condolences yesterday, was sitting patiently. Everything was arranged, the casket I'd picked out through a blur of tears, the flowers I'd ordered, the reception at the little Italian place Arthur had loved. His mother, Eleanor, had called me a half-hour ago, her voice tight with a grief that mirrored my own, asking why I hadn't arrived yet to greet the early family members. And there I was, frozen on my porch, holding a crumpled piece of paper that was screaming at me to betray my duty, to betray my husband's memory. My sister, Diane, lived just 5 minutes away. After her messy divorce from Walter 2 years ago, she'd been in a bad way. I remembered visiting her in her new, empty rental house. She was crying on the floor, surrounded by boxes. I'm so alone, Carolyn, she'd sobbed. To make her feel safer, I gave her a spare key to my place. She insisted I take one for hers, pressing it into my palm. You never know when you might need it, she'd said. It had been sitting in the bottom of my purse ever since, a forgotten piece of metal. Until now. I shoved the letter deep into the pocket of my dress. A decision had been made, not by my head, but by my feet. They were already moving, carrying me down the steps and onto the sidewalk, away from the waiting car. I walked fast, my heels clicking sharply on the pavement. A thought looped in my mind, this is insane. This is completely insane. I'm going to miss my own husband's funeral because of a stupid, cruel prank. But my legs just kept moving, pulling me toward whatever truth was waiting for me. Diane's little house looked peaceful, almost deceptively so. The white curtains were drawn, and the marigolds she'd planted in the front garden were bright in the morning sun. Everything on the surface was normal. I paused at her front gate, my hand on the cold latch, and just listened. Nothing. Maybe she was still asleep. She always did sleep late. The silence should have been reassuring, but it felt heavy. Charged. I fumbled in my purse, my fingers closing around the cold, unfamiliar key. My hand trembled as I slid it into the lock. I'd never used it before. The door opened without a sound, swinging inward into the quiet hallway. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Coffee, strong and fresh. And something else. Something layered underneath it that made the air go thin in my lungs and my stomach clench into a tight, cold knot. It was a man's cologne. A scent I knew better than my own. Arthur's cologne. I froze right there in the doorway, my hand still on the doorknob. It can't be. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe he left a bottle here once? Maybe a friend of his visited her? But no, that didn't make sense. And Diane hadn't dated anyone in over a year. She'd made a big deal about it, telling me just a few weeks ago over the phone, "I'm done with men, Carolyn. I just want to focus on myself for a while." I slipped off my heels, my stocking feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. I tiptoed down the hallway, every nerve in my body screaming. I could hear sounds from the kitchen now, the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic, water running in the sink, the quiet opening and closing of a cabinet. And then, I heard voices. 2 of them. A low, male murmur, and Diane's lighter laugh. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I was sure they could hear it. I crept to the edge of the kitchen doorway, pressing myself flat against the wall. I took a shallow breath and peeked around the frame. The scene before me was so mundane, so domestic, that for a second my brain refused to process it. A man was sitting at the small kitchen table, his back to me. He had dark hair, just like Arthur's, and broad shoulders that filled out his t-shirt in that familiar way. I saw a small, dark mole on the side of his neck, a mole I had traced with my finger 1,000 times. He was just wearing a t-shirt and gray sweatpants, lounging as if he owned the place. Diane was by the stove, humming softly as she flipped a pancake, wearing a silky robe, her hair a messy bun on top of her head. They looked like any other couple on a lazy morning. And then the man turned his head slightly to say something to her, and I saw his profile. The world stopped. It was Arthur. My husband. The man whose body I had identified at the morgue. The man who was supposed to be in a closed casket at a funeral home across town. The man I was supposed to be burying in less than 2 hours. He was alive. He was sitting in my sister's kitchen, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, looking healthy and relaxed. I think I stopped breathing. My mind went blank, filled with a roaring white noise, like static on a television screen when the signal is lost. I couldn't form a thought. I could only watch. Diane brought a plate with a pancake over to the table and set it in front of him. She leaned down and he tilted his head back, and they shared a soft, lingering kiss. Then she walked behind his chair and put her hands on his shoulders, kneading them gently. He reached up and covered her hand with his, patting it tenderly. It was a gesture of such easy intimacy, of long-practiced affection. They were happy. At the exact moment I was supposed to be delivering a eulogy, my husband was sitting in my sister's kitchen, being served breakfast, and he was happy. I don't know how I did it, but I stepped back from the door, as silent as a ghost. My legs were shaking so badly I thought they would give out. I made it back to the hallway, fumbled to put on my shoes, and walked out the front door, closing it softly behind me. I stood at the gate for a long moment, the crumpled letter still in my pocket. My world hadn't just collapsed. It had been a lie all along. The walk home was a blur. I don't remember my feet touching the pavement. I must have looked like a ghost, because an elderly woman walking her dog stopped and stared at me, a look of pity on her face. A woman in a black funeral dress, wandering aimlessly with a vacant expression. The driver was still parked in front of my house, now looking genuinely worried. "Carolyn, we really have to go," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The service starts in 45 minutes. I looked at him, at his kind, concerned face, and I couldn't form a single word. How do you tell a stranger that your entire life is a sham? How do you explain that you can't go to your husband's funeral because he's alive and well, and in love with your sister? How do you say that this entire, elaborate ritual of grief is a sick performance, and you've just discovered you're the only one who didn't get a script?" He took a step closer. "Carolyn, are you all right? You look pale. Do you need a doctor?" I just shook my head, turned, and walked back into my house, locking the door firmly behind me. I leaned against the cool wood, and the dam finally broke. I slid down to the floor and sobbed, but the tears weren't for the husband I thought I'd lost. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. Of humiliation. Of the nauseating realization that I had been played for a complete and utter fool. For the next hour, the phone was a relentless torment. First Eleanor, her voice frantic. "Carolyn, where are you? People are arriving." Then Arthur's brother, Russell, his tone sharper, bordering on angry. Then friends, their calls filled with confusion and worry. I ignored every single one. I unplugged the landline from the wall and threw my cell phone onto the sofa, letting it buzz itself into silence. Let them think what they wanted. Let them think I'd collapsed from grief. Let them have their funeral for an empty box. Later that evening, long after the funeral was over, there was a knock on the door. I knew it would be her. I took a few deep breaths, splashed cold water on my red, swollen face, and practiced a look of exhausted sorrow in the mirror. I had to be a better actor than she was. When I opened the door, Diane stood there, the very picture of a grieving sister-in-law. Her eyes were puffy, her mascara was smudged, and she was still in her black dress. She lunged forward and wrapped me in a hug that felt like a cage. "Oh, Carolyn. I was so worried sick about you." "We all were," she cried into my shoulder. "I kept calling, everyone did. When you didn't show up, we thought something terrible had happened. The service was beautiful, but it wasn't right without you." She pulled back, her eyes swimming with fake tears. "Patrick. Arthur, he was like a brother to me. I can't believe he's gone." I just stood there, letting her hold me, my body rigid. Inside, a cold, hard resolve was forming. I could scream, I could rage, I could confront her right here on my doorstep. But what would that accomplish? They would deny everything. They would call me crazy, hysterical from grief. No. That wasn't the way. I looked into my sister's lying eyes and made a promise to myself. I would play the part of the grieving widow. I would let them think their secret was safe. And I would gather my evidence, piece by painful piece, until I had enough to burn their entire world to the ground. The performance began the very next morning. I started by calling Eleanor, Arthur's mother. I could hear the icy disapproval in her voice before she even said hello. "Carolyn," she said, her tone clipped. We were all terribly concerned. I took a shaky breath, summoning tears I didn't have to fake anymore, though their source had changed. "Eleanor, I am so sorry," I sobbed into the phone. I don't know what happened. I was getting ready, and the next thing I knew, I woke up on the floor. The doctor thinks I fainted from the shock and exhaustion. It was a weak lie, but it was all I had. Her tone softened, just a little. "Oh, you poor dear. Of course. It's been a terrible strain on you. We made plans to meet at her house the following day. She said there were some of Arthur's things from the hospital to pick up, and we needed to talk about the inheritance. The word hung in the air between us, cold and practical. I arrived at her house the next day, dressed in black, my face pale and drawn. The house was a shrine to Arthur, photos of him as a boy, a teenager, a man, on every surface. It made my stomach churn. His brother, Russell, was there too, looking stern. He hugged me briefly and said he was glad I was feeling better. We sat in the formal living room, the air thick with unspoken things. Eleanor talked about the funeral, who had come, what they had said. Then Russell cleared his throat and pulled out a large manila folder. "Carolyn, we need to go over some paperwork," he said gently. "Arthur made sure you would be taken care of." He walked me through the deed to the house, the car title. Then he opened the life insurance policy. He slid it across the coffee table toward me. "It's all very straightforward," he said. My eyes scanned the page until they landed on the section marked beneficiaries. My name was there, of course, Carolyn Whitaker, 70%. And right below it, another name, Diane Miller, 30%. I felt a hot flash crawl up my neck. I looked up at Russell, carefully keeping my expression one of simple confusion. "Diane?" I didn't know Arthur had included her. Russell gave me a sympathetic shrug. "He changed it about 2 months ago. You know Arthur, he always had a soft spot for your sister. After her difficult divorce, he said he wanted to make sure she had a little something to help her get back on her feet. He was a good man. A good man." The words echoed in my head. 2 months ago. It wasn't a spontaneous act of kindness. It was a calculated part of their plan. They weren't just stealing a life together, they were divvying up the spoils of my grief. When I got home, I couldn't rest. I went through the box of Arthur's personal things Eleanor had insisted I take. It was mostly old books, CDs, photos. But at the very bottom, my fingers touched the spine of a plain, checkered notebook. I opened it. For the first several pages, it was just what you'd expect, meeting notes, shopping lists, phone numbers. But then, the handwriting became more hurried, more secretive. And then I found it. A section titled simply, "The Plan." I sat on the edge of our bed and read as my world crumbled for the 3rd time. It was all there, in Arthur's familiar script. A cold, methodical, step-by-step guide to faking his own death. Dr. Albright, cardiology, confirm bribe. Forged medical records Russell can assist with contacts. Stage funeral with Miller and Sons, they are discreet. He had even made notes on his own performance. Need to start pulling away from Carolyn. Talk less, show less affection. Will make it easier to disappear. And then, the line that felt like a knife twisting in my gut, "Diane is getting nervous. Need to reassure her it will all work. She's the key." He had been acting. 4 months. Every tired sigh, every complaint of chest pain, every night he turned away from me in bed saying he didn't feel well, it was all a lie. A meticulously rehearsed performance. And I had been his captive audience. Later that night, as I was hanging up the coat I'd worn that fateful morning, my fingers brushed against a piece of paper in the pocket. It was another envelope. Same plain white paper, same typed letters. I opened it with trembling hands. They've been planning this for months. He chose her. It wasn't a prank. It was a lifeline. Someone was out there, watching, and for some reason, they were trying to help me. I now had my mission. I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was a hunter. The existence of a plan, a cold, calculated blueprint for my deception, shifted something inside me. The fiery rage began to cool into something harder, more focused. This wasn't just about a cheating husband and a backstabbing sister anymore. This was a conspiracy. And as I lay awake that night, my mind kept replaying one chilling detail, the seamless efficiency of it all. The bribed doctor, the discreet funeral home, the forged documents Russell could apparently help with. This wasn't their first time. A new, terrifying thought began to take root. What about Diane's first husband, Walter? Walter had died 2 years ago. He was only 35. The official cause of death was a sudden, massive heart failure in his sleep. Diane had found him in the morning. At the time, it was a tragedy. Now, it looked like a dress rehearsal. The next day, I began to dig. My grief was the perfect cover. No one questioned the widow who needed to keep busy to avoid thinking. I started with public records. It didn't take long to find the threads. The funeral home that handled Walter's service was Miller and Sons, the same one listed in Arthur's notebook. The doctor who signed Walter's death certificate was a Dr. Albright, the same name from the notebook. And the lawyer who handled Walter's will and estate, a man named Victor Sinclair, was the same man Russell had told me was the executor for Arthur's will. The pattern was too perfect, too clean. My next stop was the cemetery where Walter was buried. It was a quiet, older section of the grounds. I found his grave under a large oak tree, a simple granite headstone with a smiling photo of him. He looked so young, so full of life. While I was standing there, an old groundskeeper named Peter was tending to some nearby flowers. I struck up a conversation, telling him I was a distant cousin of Walter's, just visiting. He remembered the funeral. Strange one, that was, he said, leaning on his rake. Not many people. And they were in a real hurry. Got the coffin in the ground and covered it up faster than I've ever seen. Seemed like they couldn't wait to be done with it. Then he lowered his voice. And another thing. We got procedures here. After the family leaves, we seal the vault. Standard practice. But with that one, it never got done. The order came down to postpone it for some technical reason. Never did hear what that was. My blood ran cold. An unsealed grave. I went to the cemetery office, and a clerk confirmed it after checking a dusty ledger. The grave was, officially, unsealed. It meant anyone could have opened it. It meant there might be nothing inside it at all. Armed with this terrifying new information, I found Walter's parents. They lived in a small, tidy house across town. His mother, Patricia, was hesitant to talk at first, but when I told her I suspected Walter's death was not what it seemed, the floodgates opened. She told me that in the weeks before he died, Walter had been a different person, anxious and angry. He'd confessed to her that he and Diane were having serious problems, that she was constantly demanding money for a lifestyle they couldn't afford, and had threatened a very messy divorce. The day he died, Diane had the body removed from the house by the funeral home before Patricia and her husband could even get there to say goodbye. Diane had insisted on a closed-casket funeral, saying it would be too traumatic for everyone to see him. They had always felt something was wrong, but they were paralyzed by grief and had no idea where to even begin questioning a death certificate. They gave me their blessing to do whatever it took to find the truth, even an exhumation. But when I tried to pursue official channels, I hit a wall of concrete. A lawyer told me I had no grounds. The medical examiner's office refused to review the case, stating Dr. Albright was a physician in good standing. It was a closed circle, and I was on the outside. That night, my phone rang. It was an unlisted number. I answered, and a distorted, raspy voice, like someone speaking through a handkerchief, said, "Stop digging into things that don't concern you, Mrs. Whitaker. Some graves are better left undisturbed. It would be dangerous for your health." The line went dead. It was a threat. And it was the final confirmation I needed. I wasn't just dealing with con artists. I was dealing with something far more dangerous. The threatening phone call should have terrified me into silence. Instead, it lit a fire under me. They were scared. I was getting close to something they desperately wanted to keep buried. But I was also completely alone, fighting a network that seemed to have its tentacles everywhere. I was beginning to lose hope. And then, 2 days later, my phone rang again. It was an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer. But I did. The voice on the other end was a young woman, hesitant and nervous. "Is this Carolyn Whitaker?" she asked. "Who is this?" I responded, my voice sharp. "My name is Beverly," she said quickly. "You don't know me, but I think we have something in common. His name is Arthur." We met the next day at a small, out-of-the-way cafe where no one would know us. Beverly was in her mid-20s, with bright, intelligent eyes that were shadowed with a pain I recognized all too well. She told me her story. A year and a half ago, she'd met Arthur through a mutual friend. He'd introduced himself as a divorced businessman, charming and attentive. He'd swept her off her feet, talked about their future, about building a life together. Then, after 3 months, just as she was falling completely in love, he started pulling away, claiming work emergencies. And then he just vanished. His phone was disconnected, his work address was a fake. Heartbroken and confused, she hired a private investigator. That's when she discovered the truth. He wasn't divorced. He was married. To me. "I am so sorry," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I had no idea. If I had known, I never would have." I reached across the table and put my hand on hers. "It's not your fault," I said, and for the first time, I felt a crack in the wall of ice around my heart. He lied to both of us. But Beverly had more. Her PI had kept digging. He'd found 2 other women. We decided to contact them. The first was Janice, a woman in her late 40s who had just taken an early retirement package. Arthur had approached her with a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity. He posed as a financial wizard, showed her fake documents, and convinced her to invest her entire nest egg, over $200,000. The day after she transferred the money, he was gone. When she went to the police, they treated her like a fool, dismissing it as a bad investment and closing the case. She'd lost everything. The other woman was Lorraine, a married mother of 2. Arthur had played the part of the tortured artist, her supposed soulmate. He convinced her she was trapped in a loveless marriage, promising to marry her as soon as she left her husband. She was days away from filing for divorce and potentially losing custody of her children when a friend recognized Arthur from a photo and warned her that he was a known con artist. A few days later, the 4 of us sat together in that same cafe. A widow, a jilted lover, a financially ruined retiree, and a woman who almost threw her family away. We were Arthur's victims. But as we sat there, sharing our stories, our pain, our anger, something shifted. We weren't just victims anymore. "He thinks he can just get away with this," Janice said, her voice trembling with rage. "He destroys lives and just moves on to the next one." "Not anymore," I said, looking at each of them. "He's not just dealing with one of us now. He's dealing with all of us." In that little cafe, over lukewarm coffee, an alliance was forged. We decided to pool what little resources we had left. Janice offered to rehire the PI to track Arthur's finances. Lorraine's journalist friend was a crime reporter who might be interested in a story about a serial con artist. Beverly was a whiz at online research. And my job, we all agreed, was the most dangerous. I was the one on the inside. I had to keep watching Arthur and Diane. The hunt for Arthur Whitaker, or whatever his real name was, had begun in earnest. We were coming for him. Our alliance gave me a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just acting out of rage anymore, I was fighting for justice, not just for me, but for all of us. My first move had to be tactical. I needed to know their movements, their routines, and most importantly, I needed to confirm the location of their hideout. I went to a nondescript electronics store in a strip mall across town. I felt like a character in a spy movie, my heart thudding nervously as I tried to act casual. I bought a small, magnetic GPS tracker, no bigger than a quarter. The young clerk showed me how to activate it and link it to an app on my phone. People use these for their luggage, he said with a shrug. Or, to make sure their teenager isn't speeding. I just nodded, paid in cash, and left. The next afternoon, I put my plan into action. I drove to Diane's apartment complex and parked down the street, waiting. I felt a surge of adrenaline when I saw her come out of the building and get into her car. She was heading to the big mall on the interstate. Perfect. I followed her at a safe distance. When she parked and went inside, I saw my window. The parking lot was sprawling and busy, giving me cover. I pulled my car into a spot a few rows away, got out, and walked calmly towards her car, my purse clutched in my hand. My heart was pounding, certain that 100 pairs of eyes were on me. I knelt down as if to tie my shoe, reached under the rear bumper, and with a soft, satisfying click, the magnetic tracker attached itself to the car's frame. I stood up, walked away without looking back, got into my car, and drove off. When I was a few blocks away, I pulled over and opened the app. A little red dot blinked steadily on the map. It worked. I had them. For a few days, the dot just moved between Diane's apartment and her office. But then, on a Friday evening, it started moving again. This time, it wasn't heading downtown. It was leaving the city, heading east towards the state forest. I watched on my phone, my breath held tight in my chest, as the red dot traveled down highways, then onto smaller county roads, and finally, onto a thin, unnamed line that snaked into a dark green patch on the map. Then, it stopped. I looked at the location. It was a remote, wooded area about 20 miles out of town. What was she doing there? The next morning, I got in my car and followed the route the tracker had taken. The paved road soon turned to gravel, and then to a rutted dirt track. The woods pressed in on both sides, tall pines blocking out the sun. It felt like I was driving off the edge of the world. Just as the app indicated, I saw a barely visible turn-off. I took it, and a few hundred yards in, tucked away behind a thicket of trees, I saw it. A small, run-down house, with Diane's car parked out front. I parked my own car farther back down the track, hidden from view, and approached on foot, using the trees for cover. I pulled out a pair of binoculars. Lights were on inside. Smoke curled from the chimney. And then I saw them. Arthur came out onto the porch to chop some wood. He moved with an energy and strength that made a mockery of his supposed heart failure. A little while later, Diane joined him, and they stood there, arms wrapped around each other, looking out at the woods. They looked peaceful. Happy. I went home and did some research on the property records. The house was owned by a shell company, registered just a month prior. And the director of the company? A lawyer named Kevin Dalton, the same man who had filed the court order to freeze my bank accounts. It was all connected. This wasn't just a love nest. It was their base of operations. And I had just found it. Finding their hideout felt like a major victory, but it also meant we were getting dangerously close. The pushback was immediate and brutal. Arthur's network wasn't just going to let us expose them. They were going to dismantle our lives first. The first call was from my boss, Nadine. I hadn't been to work since the funeral, but I had been in touch, telling her I needed more time. This time, her voice was different. It was cold, corporate. "Carolyn," she said, without any preamble, "we've had some complaints from clients about missed deadlines before your leave. And some colleagues have expressed concern about your erratic behavior." I was stunned. Erratic behavior? "Nadine, my husband just died. I understand it's a difficult time," she said, her voice devoid of any real sympathy. "Which is why we think it's best if you take an indefinite, unpaid leave of absence to sort out your personal issues." I was being fired. There was no other word for it. Someone had called her, fed her lies, and she had buckled. My career, my salary, my professional identity, gone, just like that. Next, Beverly called me, frantic. The private investigator Janice had hired called her and dropped our case. He wouldn't give a reason, just mumbled something about a conflict of interest and warned her to be very careful. He sounded terrified. Then came the final, crushing blow. I went to the bank to try and access the small emergency fund I had in a separate account under my own name. The teller looked at me with pity. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitaker," she said softly. "There's a legal hold on all your assets." She showed me the court order. It had been filed by their lawyer, Kevin Dalton. The document cited my documented mental instability and the risk that I might misuse the funds. They were using their fabricated evidence to cut me off completely. I was penniless. The psychological warfare intensified. My longtime neighbor, a sweet woman I'd shared coffee with for years, saw me in the grocery store and quickly turned her cart down another aisle, avoiding my eyes. My friend Gloria called me, her voice trembling. "Carolyn, what is going on?" she asked. "Someone called my husband's office. They told his boss that I was friends with a dangerously unstable woman who was harassing her grieving family. They were poisoning every relationship I had, turning my own community against me." The most surreal moment came when I went to my family doctor for a routine checkup. As I was leaving, he gently suggested I see a specialist. "Grief can do strange things, Carolyn," he said kindly. "We have a good psychiatrist we can refer you to." I looked at him, horrified, and saw it in his eyes. He believed the lies, too. They had sent him my fake medical records. The final call came from Eleanor. Her voice was pure venom. "I have heard what you are doing, Carolyn. You are dragging my son's name through the mud with your disgusting fantasies. This stops now. If you do not agree to be voluntarily hospitalized for treatment, the family will seek a court order to have you committed. We will protect Arthur's honor." They were going to have me locked away in a psych ward. They had taken my job, my money, my friends, and now they were coming for my freedom. I was completely and utterly cornered. And I knew then that I had only one move left. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and it was the only hope I had. They had left me with nothing. No job, no money, no credibility. In their minds, they had already won. They thought I would crumble, that I would check myself into a hospital just to make the pressure stop, or that I would simply fade away. They underestimated me. When you take everything from a person, you also take away their fear. I spent the next 2 days meticulously planning. Using the GPS tracker, I watched their patterns. They were creatures of habit. They would leave the cabin around 9 a.m., drive into the city for their various errands, which I now knew involved meeting with their network of co-conspirators, and they wouldn't return until after dark. That gave me a window. On a Tuesday morning, I put my plan into motion. I dressed in an old pair of dark jeans and a black hoodie. In a small backpack, I packed the essentials, a multi-tool with a screwdriver, a small high-powered flashlight, a pair of thick gloves, and my burner phone. I drove my old car, the one they wouldn't recognize, and parked it over a mile away from the turnoff to the cabin, hidden in a thicket of trees. The rest of the way, I went on foot. The woods were silent except for the crunch of my own footsteps on the dry leaves. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. I crept through the trees, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Finally, the cabin came into view. It looked quiet, dormant. I watched it for a full 30 minutes from the cover of the woods, making sure there were no signs of life, no unexpected cars. Then, I moved. I circled the house first, my feet silent on the pine needles. The doors were solid, the windows latched from the inside. It was just as I remembered. But in the back of the house, half hidden by overgrown bushes, was the small, grimy basement window. The frame was old wood, soft and rotting in places. This was my way in. I pulled on my gloves and took out the screwdriver. Kneeling in the dirt, I began to gently pry at the edge of the window frame. The wood splintered with a soft, sickening sound. I froze, listening. Nothing. I went back to work, my movements slow and deliberate. A dog barked in the distance, and my entire body went rigid. I waited, holding my breath, until the barking faded. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, the frame was loose enough. I pulled, and the window swung inward with a low groan. I took one last look around, then swung my legs over the sill and dropped into the musty, damp darkness of the basement. I landed softly on the dirt floor. I was in. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The basement was filled with junk, old furniture covered in dusty sheets, gardening tools, stacks of forgotten boxes. I found the wooden stairs leading up to the main floor. The door at the top was a simple knob, unlocked. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and deceit. I turned the knob, pulled the door open, and stepped out of the darkness and into the heart of their lies. The house was utterly still. It was time to find out what they were hiding. Stepping out of the basement into the main house was like entering another world. It was surprisingly clean, sparsely furnished but lived in. The silence was unnerving. I moved quickly, my flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The first room was a simple bedroom. On the nightstand, I found a wallet. Inside was a driver's license with Arthur's picture, but the name was Ian Ross. Next to it was a passport with the same name. He had a complete, fake identity. The next room was an office, and what I saw there made me gasp. The walls were covered in corkboards. Pinned to them were maps of the city, and dozens of photographs. My photograph. There were pictures of me leaving my house, getting groceries, walking into my office building. They had been conducting full-scale surveillance on me for months. I moved to the computer on the desk. A sticky note beside it had a string of numbers, a password. I typed it in, and the screen flickered to life. The desktop was meticulously organized. One folder was labeled Carolyn Surveillance, filled with hundreds more photos and logs of my movements. Another, Carolyn Contacts, had a list of all my friends and family, with cruel notes about their weaknesses and how to exploit them. And then I saw it. A folder titled simply, Destruction Plan. My hand was shaking as I double-clicked. It opened to reveal a series of documents, a cold, corporate-style blueprint for my annihilation. It detailed every step, how to use their legal contacts to freeze my assets, which of my colleagues to approach with lies to get me fired, how to forge the medical records and which doctor would sign off on them. The final phase of the plan was scheduled for the following week, filing a petition for my involuntary commitment, using the fabricated evidence and coerced witness statements from people they had manipulated. They were going to have me locked away forever. I plugged in the flash drive I'd brought and began the frantic process of copying everything. While the files transferred, I searched the desk drawers. I found a binder filled with information on other women, photographs, financial statements, personal details. It was a target list. We weren't the first, and we wouldn't be the last. But the most horrifying discovery was in the adjacent room. The door was locked, but the flimsy lock gave way easily. Inside was a small, windowless space humming with electronic equipment. It was a control room. Monitors lined one wall, displaying live feeds from tiny cameras, one pointed at my own front door, another across the street from my friend Gloria's house. On a table was sophisticated audio equipment. I pressed play on a digital recorder and heard my own voice, twisted and manipulated. They had taken snippets from hundreds of my phone calls and stitched them together to create monstrous new sentences. I heard myself confessing to being paranoid, to threatening Diane, to having violent thoughts. It was the proof they were going to use to have me committed. I copied everything, the video feeds, the audio files, the entire horrifying archive of their crimes. I found a safe in the closet, and it was unlocked. Inside were stacks of cash and at least 5 more sets of passports and IDs for Arthur, each with a different name. I took photos of everything with my phone. The flash drive was full. I had it. I had it all. I had to get out. I crept back to the basement, climbed out the window, and pushed it shut. I didn't look back. I ran through the woods, my lungs burning, my mind reeling from the sheer, calculated evil I had just witnessed. I made it back to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove away, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. I had the truth on a tiny piece of plastic in my pocket. But now, the real danger was just beginning. If you're still listening to me now, please help me by liking this video and commenting the number 1 below. It lets me know that you've given me a like and that you're here with me on this journey. Your support is a tremendous encouragement, cheering me on. Please comment the number 1 and listen as I tell you what happened next. Driving home from the cabin, I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. The flash drive in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. I had the weapon, but I knew I had to be incredibly careful about how I used it. The local police were out of the question, Arthur's network was too entrenched. I had one shot to expose this, and I couldn't miss. I thought of Lorraine's friend, the journalist Herbert Lennox. He was a local legend, an old-school investigative reporter with a primetime show famous for taking down corrupt politicians and crooked businesses. He was fearless, and more importantly, he had a platform that couldn't be ignored. That night, I composed an email to him. I kept it short and to the point. I told him I had irrefutable proof of a massive fraud, conspiracy, and psychological abuse scheme involving a man who had faked his own death. I attached just one thing, the short, damning video clip of Arthur in his disguise, his face clearly visible for 3 seconds. I hit send and waited, my stomach in knots. He replied in less than an hour. I'm interested. Meet me tomorrow. Diner off Route 9. 10 a.m. Come alone. The diner was a classic old place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox. Lennox was already there, a man in his 50s with a tired but intelligent face and eyes that seemed to see right through you. He was skeptical, and he didn't hide it. Ma'am, he said after I sat down, I get a dozen emails like yours a week. Bitter divorces, custody battles, you'd be surprised what people will make up. I didn't argue. I just opened my laptop, put it on the table between us, and plugged in the flash drive. Just watch, I said. I started with the audio files. I played him the recording of Arthur calmly discussing with a lawyer how to forge my psychiatric evaluation. I saw Lennox's eyebrows shoot up. Then I showed him the destruction plan document with its meticulous, cruel timeline. I showed him the surveillance photos, the fake passports, the target list of other women. He was silent, his skepticism melting away and being replaced by a look of stone-cold fury. When I finally showed him the live feed from the camera pointed at my own front door, he just shook his head slowly. My God, he whispered. This is monstrous. He looked me straight in the eye. We're going to verify this, every last piece. But if it checks out, I promise you, we will burn them to the ground on national television. The next week was the most nerve-wracking of my life. I stayed with my friend Gloria, too terrified to be alone in my own house. Lennox's team worked around the clock, verifying the documents, identifying the people in the network, and preparing the story. On the third day, Eleanor, Arthur's mother, showed up at Gloria's door, her face a mask of rage. She'd heard rumors, whispers that a big story was about to break. She threatened me, told me I would regret it if I slandered her son's good name. They knew. They could feel the walls closing in. On the 7th day, Lennox called. It's done, he said, his voice grim. Everything checked out. It's even worse than we thought. The program airs tomorrow night at 8. The next evening, Gloria and I sat on her sofa, a small group of my allies, Beverly, Janice, and Lorraine, with us. The show began. Lennox's face appeared on screen, serious and commanding. And then, he laid it all out for the world to see. They played the recordings of Arthur's voice. They showed the footage of him in disguise. They put the forged documents side by side with the real ones. They showed the faces of the bribed doctors and lawyers. They told the stories of the other victims. It was a meticulous, brutal, and undeniable takedown. By the time the show was over, my phone was exploding. But this time, it wasn't accusations or threats. It was friends, old colleagues, even distant relatives, all calling, their voices a mix of shock, horror, and apology. The truth was out. The game was over. The fallout from the broadcast was immediate and absolute. The morning after the show, a swarm of news vans and reporters descended on Diane's apartment complex. She tried to leave for work and was mobbed. I saw the footage later, her face, pale and panicked, screaming at the cameras that it was all lies, that I was a vindictive, mentally ill woman who had fabricated everything. But her denials were drowned out by the mountain of evidence Lennox had presented. Her performance was finally over. The public pressure was immense, and the district attorney, facing a massive scandal, had no choice but to act. A major crimes investigation was launched. Warrants were issued. The network they had built so carefully began to crumble. The bribed doctors, the crooked lawyers, the bank manager, they were all arrested, their careers and reputations ruined. A few days later, we got the news we had all been waiting for. Arthur had been apprehended by federal agents at the Canadian border. He was trying to flee the country using one of his fake passports. The image of him on the evening news, in handcuffs, his face gaunt and stunned, the arrogant swagger completely gone, was the first moment of true peace I had felt in months. The legal battles were long and draining, but I wasn't alone anymore. All of us, Arthur's victims, stood together. We testified at his trial, our voices clear and strong. We watched as his high-priced lawyers tried to paint him as a man with a personality disorder, not responsible for his actions. But the psychiatric evaluations, and the cold, hard evidence from the flash drive, proved otherwise. In the end, he was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had listened intently to every word of testimony, sentenced him to 12 years in a maximum security prison. He was also ordered to pay full restitution for every dollar he had ever stolen. Diane, facing her own trial, had a complete breakdown. After a failed suicide attempt, she was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial in the traditional sense. She was found guilty but given a suspended sentence, conditional on her spending years in a secure psychiatric facility. There was no victory in her downfall, only a sad, empty feeling for the sister I once had. After it was all over, I finalized my divorce. I won a significant civil suit against Arthur's frozen assets, which I used to help Janice get back on her feet and to fund a support center for victims of romantic fraud, which Beverly now runs. It's been 2 years since the sentencing. Life is quiet now. I moved to a new town, started fresh. I wrote a book about my experience, hoping that my story might be a warning sign for someone else, a glimmer of hope for another woman who feels lost in the dark. People sometimes ask me if I'm happy. It's a complicated question. But I can say this, I am strong. I am free. And I am no longer afraid. They tried to destroy me, to erase me. But they failed. What they did wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one. It wasn't grief. It was a rebirth. Thank you for listening.